Welcome to Inspirational True Stories, your go-to source for thrilling, dramatic, and trending stories from the Reddit community. This is your space to dive into unexpected tales, intense situations, and the hottest topics being discussed daily. Ever wonder how you'd react if you were in these situations? What would you do if you were the main character in these stories? Don't miss out on the twists and mind-bending moments. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these captivating stories. Ready to join in? Leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts on these stories. The morning sun had barely risen over the bustling cityscape, casting a golden glow onto the sidewalks as the rush of pedestrians and traffic filled the air. Jamal West moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, his every step purposeful, his tailored suit and polished shoes a testament to his hard work and success. Tall and well-built, Jamal radiated an understated power, his gaze steady and focused as he headed toward the familiar parking garage just down the block. He had just finished a quick breakfast at his favorite cafe, feeling energized and ready to tackle the day's cases at his law firm. As he approached his sleek black sedan, parked neatly among rows of cars, two police officers emerged from the shadow of the building's entrance. Officers Riley and Jenkins, their expressions hard and unyielding, approached him with an air of suspicion. Riley's gaze lingered on Jamal a moment too long, as if sizing him up, already casting judgment. Jamal felt their eyes sweep over him in all too familiar scrutiny that weighed on him as a black man in this city. But he held his ground, his expression calm yet wary, aware of his rights but fully conscious of the delicate situation that was unfolding. Riley took a step forward, stopping just close enough to block Jamal's path. "Can I see some ID?" he demanded, his voice low and authoritative. Jamal's brow furrowed, but he kept his tone steady and polite. "May I ask why?" he replied, his voice calm yet firm, his question a quiet assertion of his rights. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Jenkins, standing just behind Riley, crossed his arms. They shared a glance before Riley's voice took on an edge, just a routine check. "Where are you coming from?" Jamal's patience thinned, but he remained composed. "I'm heading to my car after breakfast." His answer was brief, his posture relaxed yet undeniably aware. Riley persisted, each question dripping with an unwarranted accusation. "And what kind of work do you do?" Jamal let out a controlled breath, finally deciding to reveal what he knew might catch them off guard. "I'm a lawyer," he stated, watching the momentary surprise flash across their faces before they resumed their masks of authority. Jenkins glanced away, but Riley's suspicion didn't waver. Jenkins attempted a smug grin. "You sure you're not hiding anything?" Jamal met his gaze steadily, his voice unwavering. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer. You're welcome to check." He offered his keys, an act of both compliance and defiance. But rather than easing, the officer's demeanor hardened. Before Jamal could process their intention, Riley grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, forcing him against the car. The bite of the handcuffs and the cold press of concrete sent a shock through him. Nearby, a small crowd gathered, the faces of concerned onlookers filled with disbelief. An elderly woman's voice rang out, "What are you doing to him? He didn't do anything wrong." Jamal's mind raced, his heart beat loud and unyielding as Riley's grip tightened. The bustling street faded into a distant hum as he felt the hard edge of the car pressing against his ribs, grounding him in a reality that felt both surreal and disturbingly familiar. He forced himself to stay calm, the lawyer within him understanding that any resistance, any visible sign of frustration, could be used against him. "What exactly am I being detained for?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but edged with the slightest tremor. He couldn't help but wonder if asking would only antagonize them further, but he knew his rights and couldn't let this moment pass without pushing back, even if only a little. Riley sneered, as though the question itself was a provocation. "You were acting suspiciously, and you resisted when we approached you," he replied, his tone dismissive, as if stating an undeniable fact. Jamal's brow knitted with frustration. "Suspiciously?" he repeated, incredulous. "I'm simply going to my car after breakfast." His calm words were edged with the anger he was trying to control. Riley's gaze hardened, not swayed by Jamal's explanation. Jenkins leaned in closer, his voice lower but no less menacing. "We're just doing our job. Now stop resisting and cooperate or we'll have to use force." Jamal inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "I'm not resisting," he said, keeping his voice even. "I've been nothing but compliant." He took a risk, his voice firm but measured. "This is harassment, plain and simple." Riley's face twisted, and he stepped back slightly before looking Jamal up and down. "People like you always think you're above the law, don't you?" he muttered. almost to himself, but loud enough for Jamal and the onlookers to hear. The crowd around them began to grow, murmurs of concern and outrage bubbling through the bystanders who'd stopped to witness the escalating confrontation. An elderly woman, standing just steps away with a smartphone held firmly in her hand, began recording, her expression one of pure dismay. "He's done nothing wrong," she shouted, her voice breaking through the tension. A young man nearby nodded, pulling out his phone as well. "This is messed up," he muttered, his voice just audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "Can't believe this is happening in broad daylight." Jamal felt a mix of gratitude and frustration. He didn't want to become a spectacle, yet he knew the crowd's presence was the only protection he had. He drew in a breath, eyes meeting Riley's with quiet defiance. "This isn't over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying a weight that even Riley couldn't ignore. Riley scowled but hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the phones pointed at him. Jamal's words hung in the air, charging the moment with a tense anticipation. With a quick, silent signal, Jenkins led Jamal toward the police car, his grip firm, but the slightest bit hesitant, aware of the eyes on them. As they pushed him inside, Jamal allowed himself one last look at the crowd, his resolve strengthening with every concerned face he saw. A quiet determination settled in his chest. He had to see this through, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever stood in his shoes, facing injustice and indignity. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jamal sat in the back of the police car, his hands cuffed tightly behind him, his mind reeling with disbelief and a simmering anger he kept barely in check. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, knowing that reacting emotionally would only give these officers the ammunition they were likely looking for. He steadied himself, focusing on the facts and his rights, ready to make them listen. Officer Riley opened the door and leaned in, his face mere inches from Jamal's, eyes narrowed. "Can I see some ID?" he repeated, this time with a condescending smirk. Jamal looked at him squarely, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "I asked you before, may I ask why? Am I under arrest?" His voice was calm, though each word carried a weight of defiance that made Riley shift slightly. Riley huffed, his expression twisting with impatience. "Just answer the question, Mr. West. Where are you coming from?" His tone was laced with mock politeness, each syllable dripping with suspicion. Jamal held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm coming from breakfast on my way to work. I'm a lawyer." He allowed the last word to settle, watching as Riley's smug demeanor flickered ever so slightly. Jenkins, standing just outside the car, crossed his arms and tilted his head. "A lawyer, huh?" he drawled, as if the very idea was somehow preposterous. "What kind of law do you practice?" Jamal kept his tone steady. "Civil rights." That word seemed to hang in the air, changing the atmosphere. Riley's eyes flashed with something like recognition, though his expression hardened just as quickly. He exchanged a quick glance with Jenkins, then turned back to Jamal, his face a mask of contempt. "So you think you're better than us, is that it? Think you can get away with anything just because you know the law?" Jamal let out a controlled breath. "No," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "But I know my rights." Riley scoffed, undeterred. "Your rights?" he sneered. "You think having a law degree makes you immune? Makes you untouchable?" Jamal met his gaze, his voice unwavering. "No one is above the law, officer, and that includes you." Riley's face twisted, his jaw tight. He straightened up, glancing at Jenkins as if daring him to back down. Jenkins stepped forward, looking at Jamal with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "You sure you're not hiding anything?" he asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. Jamal held his ground. "There's nothing illegal in my car," he said firmly. "You're welcome to check if you have probable cause, but I won't consent to an unlawful search." Riley's expression soured, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Oh, I think we have plenty of cause," he muttered, grabbing Jamal's arm roughly. "Resisting arrest, obstruction, you name it." Jamal couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. Obstruction? For what, asking questions? He knew they had no grounds, but their determination to twist his words and actions into something they could punish him for was clear. Jenkins looked around, noticing the crowd still gathering nearby, recording every word, every movement. His face softened just slightly, as if realizing they were crossing a line they might not be able to step back from. But Riley's grip only tightened, his frustration evident. "Enough," Riley barked, attempting to pull Jamal from the car, but Jamal remained seated, resolute. "This isn't over," Jamal said, his voice clear and strong. "I'll see you in court." The tension was electric, each word charging the air with a sense of foreboding. Jamal's defiant statement struck a chord not only with the officers but also with the watching crowd. People murmured in agreement, and the phones continued recording, capturing the promise of accountability that hung between Jamal and the officers. Riley's face hardened further, but a flicker of uncertainty danced in his eyes as he closed the car door, shutting Jamal inside with a final, reluctant slam. Inside the cramped backseat of the police car, Jamal's thoughts were a storm of disbelief, anger, and controlled defiance. The officers had crossed a line, and he knew it. The weight of their unjust actions pressed on him, but he refused to let his frustration show. His gaze remained steady as Officer Riley opened the door once more, a thin smirk on his face, as if savoring the control he thought he had. Riley leaned down, his face close to Jamal's. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Jamal met Riley's gaze, refusing to flinch. "I'm just a man who knows his rights, officer, and that includes the right to know why I'm being detained." He let his words sit, calm but edged with the quiet power of conviction. Riley let out a scoff, glancing over his shoulder to Jenkins, who stood nearby with crossed arms, his expression dark with suspicion. Riley turned back to Jamal, as if determined to see this through. "What do you do for a living, Mr. West? Surely someone like you has a respectable job," he sneered, the sarcasm thick in his tone. Jamal held his gaze, his voice steady as he replied, "I'm an attorney." He watched as the word took root in the air, altering the tension between them. Riley's expression faltered, if only for a split second, as he processed the revelation. "An attorney?" Jenkins echoed, surprise momentarily breaking his hardened demeanor. He looked Jamal up and down, assessing him with renewed scrutiny. "What kind of attorney are you?" "Civil rights," Jamal answered, his voice unwavering. He knew that saying the words out loud would either intimidate them or, at the very least, make them question their actions. A flicker of something like apprehension crossed Riley's face, though he quickly masked it with a hardened stare. "So, what you think knowing the law means you're untouchable?" Jamal allowed a slight, unyielding smile to form at the corner of his lips. "It means I know when my rights are being violated, Officer Riley. And what's happening here? This is harassment." Riley's face contorted, the muscle in his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain control over the situation. He straightened up, turning toward Jenkins, who looked slightly less sure of their actions now. The crowd that had gathered nearby continued to record, murmurs of concern and disbelief filling the air, each phone camera pointed at them like a silent witness to the injustice unfolding. Jenkins cleared his throat, his tone forced. "Look, Mr. West, if that's really who you are, then why not just cooperate with us? Surely someone with your background understands that it's in everyone's best interest." Jamal felt a spark of indignation. "I have cooperated," he replied firmly. "I've answered every question. I've shown respect, despite being treated as a criminal without reason. So let me ask you, why am I in cuffs? Is being black and walking to my car now probable cause for detention?" The directness of his words seemed to land with weight, and Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glancing toward the crowd that was still growing. A few voices spoke out, louder this time, a chorus of support that echoed through the street. "Let him go," an elderly woman called out, her voice clear and unwavering. "Enough is enough," murmured another voice in the crowd, as more people raised their phones, recording every detail. Riley's confidence wavered, and his gaze flickered toward the crowd before snapping back to Jamal. "Look, you're only making this harder for yourself," he said, but his voice had lost its edge, the authority that once backed his words now sounding hollow. Jamal leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Riley's, his tone soft but resolute. "No, Officer Riley, you're the ones making this harder. You're the ones crossing the line, and you'll answer for it." Riley's jaw clenched, the gravity of Jamal's words settling between them. Jamal could see the shift in his eyes, the doubt creeping in, a growing awareness that this wasn't an ordinary arrest and that Jamal wasn't an ordinary man. The tension in the air felt thick and charged, hanging between Jamal and the officers as if something was bound to snap. The crowd continued to grow, murmurs of disbelief and frustration rippling through as people watched, recording every second on their phones. Jamal's calm, unyielding defiance was a sharp contrast to Riley's increasingly hostile demeanor. Riley's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "All right, that's enough," he barked, taking a step closer to Jamal, his voice a low growl that was meant to intimidate. "You want to make this difficult? Fine, you're under arrest." The words hung in the air, a shock that reverberated through the crowd. Jamal felt his pulse spike, his instincts flaring as Riley reached for his arm. twisting it back with a force that was anything but necessary. Pain shot through Jamal's shoulder, but he bit down against it, refusing to let out so much as a wince. "Under arrest?" Jamal managed, his voice tight but controlled, his disbelief and anger mingling. "For what? Asking questions?" Riley's grip tightened, and he leaned in close, his face inches from Jamal's. "For resisting arrest," he said with a smirk, as though the words held some dark satisfaction for him. "An obstruction of justice." Jamal felt a flare of indignation, his voice coming out steady despite the painful angle Riley forced his arm into. "Obstruction of justice," he repeated, incredulous. "This is a false arrest, and you know it. You have no grounds." But Riley only pushed him harder against the car, pressing his weight into Jamal's back as he tightened the cuffs, making them dig into Jamal's wrists. The metal bit into his skin, the pain sharp and relentless, but Jamal held onto his composure, refusing to give Riley the reaction he was clearly fishing for. By now, the crowd's outrage had grown louder, voices rising in anger and disbelief. "This is wrong," a woman shouted from somewhere nearby, her tone thick with emotion. "Let him go. He didn't do anything." Another bystander called out, "This is police brutality." As more phones raised, catching every moment, every angle, the cameras acting as silent advocates for Jamal. "Stay back," Jenkins shouted, his voice breaking as he addressed the crowd, trying to maintain control. But there was a clear tremor in his voice, a crack in his authority as he saw the anger in the eyes of those watching. Jamal, still pressed hard against the car, caught the officer's eye, his own gaze steely and resolute. "This isn't over," he said again, his words carrying a quiet, unwavering strength. "This will come back on you." Jenkins looked away, unable to meet his gaze, but Riley's expression hardened. "You're just making things worse for yourself, Mr. West," he spat, his words seething with contempt. With a harsh shove, Riley pushed Jamal into the backseat of the patrol car, slamming the door behind him. Jamal's eyes swept over the faces of the crowd just before the door shut, locking him away from the outside world. But he saw the support in their faces, the silent promise that they wouldn't let this go unnoticed. He felt a surge of determination, a fire igniting within him. This wasn't the end, far from it. Inside the car, Jamal sat, breathing slowly, calming his mind and preparing himself. He knew what was at stake, knew that this moment would mean more than just a passing confrontation. He knew that this incident, captured and shared, would shine a light on the reality many tried to deny. Outside, the voices grew louder, a chorus of demands for justice, a rallying cry that resonated through the air. As the car began to move, Jamal allowed himself a small, resolute smile. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. As the police car carrying Jamal began to pull away from the curb, the crowd left behind erupted with a collective surge of emotion. Shock, disbelief, and outrage hung thickly in the air, faces tense with concern and determination. Phones were held high, cameras recording every second. The crowd, knowing this moment needed to be shared, needed to be seen. At the front of the crowd, an elderly woman named Agnes Carter stood rooted, her expression one of fierce indignation. Her hands shook slightly, but her resolve was steady. With her phone still recording, she called out, her voice clear and unwavering. "This man did nothing wrong. He was just minding his business." Her words seemed to give courage to others who murmured in agreement, their voices rising in a wave of solidarity. "This is an outrage," someone shouted, anger punctuating their words. "They can't just treat him like that." A young man beside her, wearing the baseball cap and a look of determined frustration, nodded vigorously. He raised his phone higher, his voice loud as he spoke to the camera. "People need to see this. They need to know this kind of thing is still happening." Around them, people exchanged looks of empathy and disbelief, a quiet camaraderie forming in their shared anger. Some whispered to each other, recounting what they'd witnessed, how Jamal had remained calm, respectful, only to be treated with unnecessary aggression. Their voices grew louder, emboldened by their collective sense of injustice. "Who do they think they are?" a woman in a red jacket asked, shaking her head. Her words were full of anger, but also a deep sadness, as if she had seen this scene unfold one too many times. "This has to stop." A middle-aged man with his young daughter on his shoulders stepped forward, his face resolute. "What they did to him was wrong, and they're going to pay for it," he muttered, mostly to himself but loud enough for others around him to hear. His daughter looked down at him, wide-eyed, her small hand gripping his shoulder. The innocence in her face made the moment feel even more poignant, a reminder of the stakes in this fight for justice and dignity. As the police car turned a corner, disappearing from sight, a young woman stepped forward, holding her phone like a lifeline. "This is going live," she said, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "People need to see the truth of what happened here today." Agnes nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "We can't let this be swept under the rug," she murmured, her voice barely audible but fierce. "Jamal deserves better. We all do." Around her, murmurs of agreement spread, a quiet determination taking root. This wasn't just about what happened to Jamal, they realized. It was about what could happen to any one of them, to anyone who simply looked out of place or asked the wrong questions. It was about standing up and refusing to be silenced. A young bystander raised his phone, addressing his online followers directly, his voice filled with the weight of the moment. "We're not just witnesses," he said firmly, looking into the camera. "We're part of this now. We have to speak out." The crowd around him nodded, their expressions resolute, shoulders squared, eyes fierce. They weren't going to walk away quietly. Agnes, the young man, the parents with their children, and countless others formed a silent pact, a promise to see this through. For a moment, there was a solemn stillness, a shared understanding. The witnesses looked at each other, bound by the injustice they had witnessed, and the promise that they would not let it be forgotten. One by one, they turned back to their phones, sharing their videos, tagging news outlets, and spreading the story. This was not going to be a quiet ending, not if they had anything to do with it. Their voices, soft, fierce, and unwavering, rose together, sending out a message of unity and justice, determined that the world would hear their truth. As the police car jerked forward, Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His body ached, but his spirit remained unbroken. Through the tinted window, he could still make out the silhouettes of the crowd, their faces determined, their phones recording, their voices carrying through the glass as they chanted for his release. Each face, each raised phone, gave him a glimmer of strength that cut through the fear and frustration simmering within him. He took a deep breath, leaning forward as far as the cuffs would allow, pressing his forehead against the cool glass, and gazed out at the faces gathered for him. He could feel their support, like a force of its own, pushing back against the injustice that surrounded him. Just as the car began to pull away, Jamal spoke, his voice clear and defiant, strong enough to pierce through the tension, reaching the ears of those who watched, those who believed in him. "This isn't over," he called out, his voice resonant with a conviction that filled the air, sharp and unwavering. "They may think they can silence us, but we won't be quiet, not now, not ever." His words hung in the air, settling over the crowd like a banner of resilience. Agnes Carter, still holding her phone, her eyes shining with tears, nodded as she murmured, "That's right, Jamal." Her words were quiet, but the resolve in her voice echoed his. The young man in the baseball cap, inspired by Jamal's words, turned his camera back to himself, his voice strong as he addressed his audience. "You heard him. This isn't over. We're going to make sure of that." He looked back at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the others who had gared, the fire in their eyes reflecting his own. Jamal's words sparked a ripple through the crowd, a unified determination that grew with every second. His simple, powerful statement ignited a sense of purpose in each witness. They understood the weight of his message, that this was not just about Jamal, but about all of them, about a shared struggle that bound them together in this moment. The injustice Jamal faced was a reminder of the reality they all lived in, one they were ready to confront. From the backseat, Jamal watched as the crowd surged forward, voices rising, calling for change, calling for justice. "This isn't over," they echoed, their voices a powerful refrain that rang out into the city streets. Even as the car disappeared down the block, their voices persisted, bouncing off buildings, weaving through the streets, a chorus of solidarity and defiance. Jamal allowed himself a faint, resolute smile, feeling a sense of power that no amount of restraint or handcuffs could suppress. He knew that his fight was just beginning, and that he wasn't alone. The faces he'd seen, the words of support, the phones recording his every move, they were all part of a force that couldn't be ignored. His voice had been heard, and it would continue to echo, carried by the people who believed in him, who believed in a future where justice could be achieved. In that moment, Jamal knew that he'd stand tall through whatever lay ahead. His defiant statement had become a promise to himself and to the people who stood by him. He would see this through, no matter how difficult, no matter how long. His voice, their voices were just getting started. This fight for justice was only beginning, and together, they would make sure it was heard far and wide. The police car rolled into the station, its tires grinding against the asphalt as it came to a halt. Jamal sat in the backseat, his wrists still cuffed, his mind a steady hum of determination. He could sense the tension, even through the heavy silence, as if the officers themselves felt the weight of their actions settling in. As Riley and Jenkins escorted Jamal out of the car and through the station doors, their expressions wavered slightly. They exchanged uneasy glances, Riley's confident smirk now replaced by a hint of unease as whispers echoed from various officers at their desks. The room seemed to pulse with a subdued chaos, a murmur of questions and curious stares directed at the handcuffed man walking with quiet strength, his presence filling the room. A younger officer, Officer Stevens, looked up from his desk, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized Jamal's face. His mouth parted, as though to speak, but he held back, a look of shock settling over him instead. He quickly pulled up a file on his computer, his gaze darting between the screen and Jamal. Just then, Lieutenant Kate Thompson walked into the room, her posture commanding, her sharp gaze taking in every detail. She noted Riley's tense stance, Jenkins's nervous glances, and the way the rest of the room seemed to focus on the man they'd just brought in. Her brow furrowed as she approached them, her eyes fixed on Jamal with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Officers Riley and Jenkins," she called, her tone firm but restrained. "A word." Riley straightened, attempting to regain his composure. "Yes, Lieutenant." She turned her attention to Jamal briefly, a glint of recognition in her eyes. "Mr. West, I'm Lieutenant Thompson. We'll be with you shortly." She motioned for the officers to follow her, leading them into a nearby conference room. As soon as the door shut, she crossed her arms, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Explain to me why we have Jamal West in custody. He's a respected attorney and a known advocate for civil rights." Riley shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly faltering under Thompson's stare. "He was behaving suspiciously," he said, though his voice held none of the certainty it had outside. "We tried to ask him questions, but he got difficult." Thompson's eyes narrowed, unimpressed. "Difficult," she repeated, each syllable laced with disbelief. "Or did he simply question your authority?" Her gaze pierced him, and he looked down, clearly unnerved. "Did Mr. West comply with your instructions?" Riley hesitated, glancing at Jenkins, who stood rigid and silent. "Well, he questioned us, and things got tense," Riley muttered, unable to meet her gaze. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. "A gut feeling, Riley. Is that the basis for an arrest now? Because if so, we have a serious problem." She leaned forward, her voice firm. "I don't want feelings. I want facts." Officer Stevens, who had slipped into the room, cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Lieutenant, Mr. West isn't just any lawyer," he said, glancing at the file on his tablet. "He's involved in multiple high-profile cases against police departments for civil rights violations. This arrest isn't just going to blow over." Thompson's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the implications. "So, you two arrested a prominent civil rights attorney on vague charges with no solid evidence." Her voice grew colder. "Do you realize the chaos you've just created?" Riley swallowed, visibly struggling to maintain his confidence. We didn't know who he was." Thompson's gaze sharpened further. "That's no excuse, Officer Riley. Your actions today have put this entire department under scrutiny, and I can guarantee you this will not end well if we don't handle it carefully." The weight of her words settled over the room, thick with the realization of what they had done. Thompson straightened, her gaze hardening as she looked between Riley and Jenkins. "This is a mess. And now we're going to have to clean it up, starting by figuring out how to handle the crowd that's already gathering outside." As she left the room, the officers' faces turned pale, the reality of their mistake becoming painfully clear. The stakes were no longer just about one arrest. It was about the credibility of the entire department, and it was only the beginning. Lieutenant Thompson closed the door to the small conference room behind her, crossing her arms and fixing her gaze on Riley and Jenkins. The silence that followed was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken judgment. She let the weight of her stare settle over them, watching as both officers shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Let's be clear here," she began, her voice measured but cold. "You detained Jamal West, a high-profile civil rights attorney, on vague charges of suspicious behavior. And now you're telling me there was no concrete evidence, only a gut feeling." Her voice hardened, each word sharp and deliberate. "Do you realize the damage you've potentially caused?" Riley cleared his throat, his usual bravado shrinking under Thompson's gaze. "Ma'am," he was confrontational, he stammered. "He questioned us. He didn't just comply, he made it difficult." Thompson's brow lifted, unimpressed. "Confrontational, difficult." She repeated his words with biting sarcasm. "So you're telling me that asking questions, asserting his rights, was enough to warrant a physical arrest?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Tell me, Riley, did Mr. West comply with your instructions?" Riley hesitated, glancing at Jenkins, who stood silent, looking down at his shoes. While he questioned our authority, Riley replied, his tone defensive but faltering. We felt it was appropriate to detain him under the circumstances. Under the circumstances? Thompson's voice was a low hiss, her frustration barely contained. She turned her gaze to Jenkins, who flinched under her stare. And you, Jenkins? Do you agree that it was appropriate to escalate this situation? Jenkins shifted, his face paling as he muttered, Lieutenant, we didn't know who he was. He didn't say anything at first. We thought he was just trying to give us a hard time. Thompson's eyes narrowed. So now it's our protocol to make assumptions about people based on how difficult we perceive them to be. She shook her head, exasperation evident. How exactly did he give you a hard time? Did he resist? Did he become violent? Riley's face twisted with frustration, and he met her gaze defiantly. Though his voice was weaker than before, he was defiant. He refused to answer us directly, wouldn't give us his ID at first. Did he refuse, or did he ask you why you needed to see it? Thompson pressed, her tone sharp as she dissected their actions. Riley's jaw tightened, his confidence unraveling under the weight of her questions. He asked why, he admitted reluctantly. Thompson's expression turned icy. So you arrested him for having the audacity to assert his rights? She took a steadying breath, visibly trying to contain her growing anger. Riley, I've warned you before about letting your ego cloud your judgment. This wasn't just bad policing, it was an abuse of power, and it's going to reflect on this entire department. Jenkins shifted, casting an anxious glance at Riley. Lieutenant, we didn't know he'd be a high-profile case, he said, a hint of desperation in his tone. We thought it would just be a routine detention, nothing more. Thompson's gaze hardened. Routine? She shook her head, disgust flashing across her face. You targeted an innocent man, a lawyer no less, based on nothing but vague suspicions, and the fact that he dared to question you. And now the entire department is at risk because of your recklessness. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of her words. Riley and Jenkins stood there, visibly deflated, the reality of their actions setting in. Thompson straightened, crossing her arms as she delivered her final blow. This is going to be more than a slap on the wrist. I want a full report on my desk within the hour, detailing every word and action. We're going to clean up this mess, and believe me, you both will be answering for it. With that, she turned and strode out of the room, leaving the two officers standing in stunned silence, their faces pale as they realized the gravity of what they'd done. As Lieutenant Thompson walked out of the conference room, her mind was racing. The gravity of the situation was only beginning to set in, and with each step, the stakes seemed to rise. She strode down the hall, her jaw clenched, trying to process the fallout that was about to unfold. Jamal West wasn't just a name. He was a prominent civil rights attorney, respected and influential. The fact that Riley and Jenkins had dragged him in on baseless charges of suspicious behavior was more than a simple mistake. It was a potential scandal waiting to explode. Stepping into her office, Thompson closed the door, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She pulled up Jamal's name in the system, reading the extensive list of cases he'd taken on, many against police departments just like theirs. His work had pushed for accountability, fighting for those who had been wrongfully targeted, unfairly profiled, and mistreated by officers who thought they were above reproach. And now he was the one facing injustice, and they were the ones about to be held accountable. She let out a heavy sigh, glancing out the window at the crowd gathering outside the station. Dozens of people were already standing there, some with signs, others holding phones and cameras, broadcasting the scene live. The public's outrage was palpable, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the media caught wind of it. As she turned back to her desk, the door opened, and Officer Stevens entered, his face lined with concern. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, his eyes flicking toward the window. "The crowd outside, it's getting bigger. They're demanding an explanation for Mr. West's arrest. It's intense." Thompson nodded, a sense of dread creeping into her chest. "I know, Stevens," she replied, her voice calm but edged with worry. "This situation has already spiraled beyond our control." She paused, weighing her next words carefully. "This isn't just about Mr. West anymore. It's about every decision we've made, every protocol we've bent or broken. It's about public trust, and right now we're hanging by a thread." Stevens shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I've heard some of the officers talking," he said softly. "They're worried this could lead to a full investigation of the department. If people dig deep enough, they're going to find other cases where things didn't exactly follow protocol." Thompson's stomach tightened. She'd worked her whole career trying to keep her department above reproach, to maintain a standard that others could respect. Yet here they were, one decision away from a crisis that could expose years of mistakes, cover-ups, and questionable decisions made in the name of justice. She took a steadying breath, her mind racing. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug," she said quietly, more to herself than to Stevens. "Riley and Jenkins have crossed a line, and now we're all in the crosshairs. If we don't handle this carefully, we'll lose whatever credibility we have left." Stevens nodded, his face grim. "What's the plan, Lieutenant?" Thompson pressed her lips into a thin line, glancing back at the crowd outside. "We need to de-escalate before this blows up any further. The first step is releasing Mr. West. There's no point in holding him here and fueling the fire." She hesitated, considering the implications of her next decision. "And we'll need a public apology from the top. The chief himself will have to address this." She turned to Stevens, her resolve hardening. "And once Mr. West is released, I'm going to personally review every detail of this arrest. If Riley and Jenkins have violated any policy, any law, they're going to answer for it." The stakes were clear now, and Thompson understood that her department's reputation and perhaps her own career depended on how she handled the next few hours. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was not going to end quietly, and she was determined to make sure it ended the right way. Outside the police station, the crowd had swelled, filling the front steps and spilling onto the sidewalk. What had begun as a handful of bystanders had grown into a united front of outraged citizens, each person adding to the growing tide of voices calling for justice. People held signs hastily scrawled with messages of support for Jamal, others chanting in unison, their voices merging into a powerful force that echoed through the streets. "Justice for Jamal." The crowd shouted, their words rising like a pulse. The message was clear, unwavering, a demand that could not be ignored. More phones were raised, broadcasting the scene lived to social media, where the story of Jamal's arrest had already begun to spread like wildfire. Videos and images of his treatment were circulating, stirring anger and disbelief among viewers. Within minutes, people across the city, and even beyond, were watching, joining in from a distance, their comments filling the live streams with calls for accountability. Near the front of the crowd stood Agnes Carter, her frail but fierce figure leading the chant. Her voice, though weathered with age, carried a strength that seemed to rally the people around her. "We're not leaving until they release him," she called, her words met with resounding agreement. A young woman in the crowd held up a hand-lettered sign that read, "This is our reality." She looked around at the faces beside her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We all know someone like Jamal," she said to the people near her, her voice catching with emotion. "We're here because this isn't just about him, it's about every single person who's been treated like they don't belong." Others nodded, their faces resolute. The crowd's anger wasn't just for Jamal, it was fueled by countless personal experiences, each person carrying their own story of discrimination, of seeing justice denied. Jamal's arrest had become a symbol, a reminder of the reality many of them faced. Their voices grew louder, a chorus of solidarity and shared purpose. Inside the station, Lieutenant Thompson felt the weight of the crowd pressing in. The chants were loud enough to penetrate the walls, filling the air with an undeniable urgency. She watched through a window as the throng continued to grow, more people arriving every minute. Some held signs, others carried cameras, and all of them radiated a determination that she knew could not be quelled by silence or excuses. Stevens entered her office, his face pale with anxiety. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, "the media's here. Reporters are setting up outside. They're asking questions, demanding answers." Thompson clenched her jaw, feeling the pressure mount. "This is exactly what we were trying to avoid," she muttered, though she knew it was too late. The situation had already spun out of control, and every second they delayed only stoked the flames higher. Her mind raced with the implications: reporters, news cameras, the community's outrage. It was a public relations disaster in the making, and the whole world was watching. A sudden chant broke out from the crowd, "Let him go. Let him go." The refrain grew louder, each word pounding like a drumbeat against the walls of the station. Thompson knew that any attempt to dismiss their demands would only escalate the situation further. They needed a plan, and fast. Turning to Stevens, she took a deep breath, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need to release Mr. West immediately. If we keep holding him, this will only get worse. Get the chief on the line and prepare a statement. We're going to have to own this, fully and publicly." Stevens nodded, hurrying out of the room as Thompson steeled herself, her gaze returning to the crowd outside. She could feel the power of their voices, their demands crashing over her like waves. They wouldn't stop until they got answers, and she knew that anything less than the truth would only fuel their determination. In that moment, Thompson realized that this wasn't just about appeasing the public or protecting the department's reputation. It was about doing the right thing, about acknowledging the voices that had long been ignored. As the chants grew louder, filling the station with their relentless demand for justice, she resolved to face the crowd with the transparency they deserved. The crowd outside the station was relentless, their voices a steady drumbeat of determination that resonated through every corner of the building. Lieutenant Thompson stood by her office window, watching the swelling numbers and feeling the pressure mount with each passing second. She'd made her choice, and the department would have to live with it. "Stevens," she said, turning to the young officer standing nearby, his face lined with concern. "We're releasing Mr. West immediately. We don't have any grounds to hold him, and the longer we keep him here, the more damage we're doing to ourselves." Stevens nodded, understanding the urgency, but his brow furrowed with hesitation. "Are you sure, Lieutenant? Riley and Jenkins won't take this well. They're already defensive about the whole situation." Thompson sighed, her frustration visible. "It's not about Riley and Jenkins anymore," she said firmly. "This is about accountability. We mishandled this, and holding Jamal any longer only adds fuel to an already raging fire." She glanced at the door, preparing herself for the inevitable confrontation with Riley and Jenkins. "And get the chief on standby for a public statement. He'll need to address this head-on if we have any hope of restoring trust." Stevens nodded and quickly left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Thompson took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her. She knew the risks releasing Jamal without a carefully crafted explanation would look like an admission of guilt, but keeping him would only escalate the crowd's outrage. Minutes later, she made her way to the holding cell where Jamal was seated, his posture calm but resolute. His eyes met hers, filled with a quiet strength that only underscored the mistake her officers had made. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Mr. West," Thompson began, her tone professional but laced with an apology she didn't voice, "we're releasing you. There was an error in the handling of this situation. On behalf of the department, I apologize." Jamal's gaze was steady, unreadable. He rose slowly, his voice calm but firm. "An error?" he repeated, his tone carrying an edge of disbelief. An error would be a misfiled report or a missed phone call. This was harassment, plain and simple. Thompson held his gaze, acknowledging his words. "You're right, and steps will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen again. Officers Riley and Jenkins will face an internal review, and the chief will be making a public statement to address this incident." Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. He adjusted his cufflinks, his composure unwavering despite the ordeal he had endured. "I appreciate your candor, Lieutenant, but this goes beyond apologies. This is about trust, and that can't be restored with words alone." Thompson inclined her head, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. "I know, and if you have any suggestions on how we can rebuild that trust, I'd like to hear them." Jamal looked at her for a long moment, considering her offer. "Then let me suggest this," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "When I walk out of here, I'm not just going back to my life. I'm going to make sure that real change happens, not just for me, but for every person who has ever been in my position." Thompson nodded, respecting his determination. "We'll be watching," she replied, her voice steady. She opened the cell door, allowing Jamal to walk out, the crowd's chants now louder than ever, filling the hallways. As Jamal made his way through the station, officers stepped aside, their faces reflecting varying degrees of discomfort, regret, and curiosity. He held his head high, his presence alone a silent reminder of the power of resilience and integrity. When he stepped outside, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their voices rising in support. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and supporters reached out, some with tears in their eyes, as Jamal raised a hand in silent acknowledgement. He looked back at the building for a brief moment, his eyes meeting Thompson's in the window, a silent promise passing between them. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice and accountability. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the crowd gathered outside the police station. Reporters had lined up in front of hastily erected barricades, microphones and cameras ready to capture every word. The tension was thick, an air of anticipation settling over the crowd as they waited for Chief Daniels to address them. Jamal's release had been a powerful moment, but the people needed more than just an apology. They needed accountability and assurance that changes would follow. Chief Daniels stepped up to the podium, his usually composed demeanor bearing the weight of responsibility. He cleared his throat, scanning the faces in the crowd, each one a reminder of the gravity of the situation. As he adjusted the microphone, the crowd's murmurs quieted, all eyes and ears fixed on him. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying a tone of solemnity. "I want to address the events that took place today involving Mr. Jamal West. As Chief of Police, it's my responsibility to ensure that every member of this community is treated with respect and fairness. Today, we failed to uphold that standard, and for that, I take full responsibility." The crowd remained silent, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and guarded hope. Chief Daniels took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Our officers were acting on what they perceived to be suspicious behavior, but in hindsight, it's clear that their judgment was clouded. There was no concrete evidence, no justifiable reason for Mr. West's arrest. His rights were violated, and the actions of Officers Riley and Jenkins were unacceptable. As of this moment, they have been suspended, pending a thorough internal investigation." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, murmurs of approval mixed with distrust. Some nodded, feeling a semblance of relief that there were consequences, while others crossed their arms, unconvinced that suspensions alone would lead to meaningful change. Chief Daniels glanced down at his notes, then back up at the crowd. "I want to be transparent with you," he continued. "This incident has brought to light areas within our department that require serious attention and reform. We've already begun discussions on implementing enhanced training programs focused on racial bias and community engagement. We are committed to creating a police force that not only serves but respects every member of our community." Reporters raised their hands, but he held up a hand to pause them. "Let me finish," he said, his tone firm but respectful. "We know that words alone are not enough. We know that an apology without action is empty. That's why, beginning today, we will be working with community leaders to establish an independent oversight committee. This committee will have full access to review cases, examine patterns, and ensure accountability within our ranks." Jamal, who stood among the crowd, watched with a measured gaze, recognizing the significance of Chief Daniels' words, but also the need for follow-through. He knew that these promises were just the first step in a long journey toward real change. Chief Daniels' voice softened, an edge of regret slipping through. "To Mr. West and to everyone here today, I want to say this: we are listening, and we are committed to doing better. This department is here to serve you, not to act as an adversary. Our mission is to build trust, not fear." He paused, letting his words settle before he continued. "We will not sweep this under the rug. We will be held accountable, and I ask that you hold us accountable." With that, Chief Daniels stepped back, signaling the end of his statement. The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and cautious approval, some voices calling out questions, others murmuring to each other. Reporters shouted, their microphones outstretched, as the chief nodded to a few, prepared to answer. For the first time in years, it felt as though change might truly be possible. And as Jamal stood among the people, a sense of cautious optimism began to grow. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step toward the justice they all sought. As the crowd settled after Chief Daniels' statement, Jamal stood near the front, taking in the faces around him, people who had come out in support, strangers who had raised their voices to demand justice. He knew this was his moment to speak, not just for himself, but for everyone who had felt silenced, dismissed, or mistreated. He stepped forward, raising a hand slightly to quiet the murmurs. The crowd responded, a hush falling over them as all eyes turned to him. Cameras shifted to capture his every movement, reporters adjusting their microphones to catch his words. Jamal's presence alone commanded attention, his quiet strength and calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the storm he had weathered just hours before. "Thank you all," he began, his voice steady but resonant, carrying across the steps of the police station. "Thank you for being here, for raising your voices when mine was taken from me. Today, we witnessed something that should never have happened. But the truth is, my experience is not unique. It's shared by so many, and that's what makes this moment so important." He turned slightly, addressing Chief Daniels directly, though his words were meant for everyone listening. "Chief, I appreciate your words, and I recognize the steps you've outlined. But this isn't just about words. Accountability, respect, and dignity, these need to be more than promises. They need to become practices that are embedded in the very fabric of this department, and in departments across the country." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd, people nodding as Jamal's words hit close to home. His voice softened slightly, but the conviction behind it was clear. What I went through today, what so many of us go through every day, is about more than just a single arrest. It's about a pattern of treatment, a system that too often views people like me with suspicion instead of respect. We're not asking for special treatment, we're asking for equal treatment. He glanced over the crowd, meeting the eyes of people who looked back at him with empathy, encouragement, and determination. "This fight isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about all of us. About making sure that no one else has to endure what I endured today. Change doesn't happen in a single day or a single press conference. It happens when every officer, every department, chooses to uphold the values they're sworn to protect." Chief Daniels listened, his face stoic but respectful, a slight nod showing that he understood the gravity of Jamal's words. Reporters' cameras flashed, capturing the raw honesty that filled the air, the power of a man who had taken his pain and turned it into a call for justice. Jamal took a deep breath, letting his words sink in, then spoke with a resolute tone. "To everyone here, to everyone watching, this isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Together, we're going to make sure that these promises don't fade, that this moment isn't just a flash in the news cycle. We're going to keep pushing, keep fighting, because that's what real change requires." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers echoing across the street, their voices merging into a single, unified sound of solidarity and resolve. Jamal turned back to Chief Daniels, nodding with a look of mutual understanding. "We'll hold you to your word, Chief," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "because the lives and dignity of our community depend on it." With that, Jamal stepped back, the crowd surrounding him in support, their applause and cheers ringing out as a powerful affirmation. His words had galvanized them, sparking a fire that wouldn't be easily extinguished. As he walked through the crowd, handshakes and pats on the back greeted him, people thanking him, encouraging him, promising to stand with him. Jamal left that day with his head held high, his spirit unbroken. He knew that this was only the beginning of the road ahead, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. Jamal took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. The crowd had quieted, their attention fixed on him, a collective energy binding them together. He looked out at the faces, seeing not just anger but a fierce determination, a readiness for action that went beyond words. This was more than a crowd, it was a community, a movement waiting to take shape. "This moment isn't just about today or about me," Jamal began, his voice resonant and filled with purpose. "It's about every injustice that has been brushed aside, every life that's been dismissed, every voice that's been silenced. Today, we're saying enough. We're saying that change is not just a choice, it's a necessity." His gaze swept over the crowd, connecting with the people who had shown up, their eyes alight with shared resolve. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't come from one apology or one policy. It comes from each of us holding our institutions accountable, demanding that they work for us, not against us. This system can't keep treating people differently based on how they look or where they come from. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, heads nodding as his words took root. Jamal's voice grew stronger, fueled by the response. "I'm not just talking about this department," he continued, gesturing toward the station behind him. "I'm talking about the entire system that allows these abuses to go unchecked, that permits certain people to look at others with suspicion while ignoring the dignity they deserve. That has to end." He paused, letting the importance of his words sink in. Today isn't just about holding a few officers accountable. It's about transforming a culture that too often views people with bias. We need policies that protect our rights, training that confronts prejudice, and leadership that isn't afraid to admit when it's wrong. He glanced over at Chief Daniels, who stood nearby, listening intently. "Chief," Jamal said, addressing him directly, "we appreciate the steps you're promising to take, but we're not going to let them fade once the cameras are off. We need independent oversight, we need transparency, and we need to know that our voices will be heard." The chief gave a solemn nod, acknowledging Jamal's words, but Jamal wasn't finished. He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising with a newfound intensity. "This isn't about one arrest, one incident, or one department. This is about rewriting the story, ensuring that our children don't grow up fearing those who are supposed to protect them. This is about justice, not the kind you see in courtrooms, but the kind you feel in your daily life, the kind that's woven into the very fabric of our society." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers ringing out as people raised their fists, their voices echoing with Jamal's words. "We want justice." They chanted, the phrase growing louder and louder, each repetition strengthening their unity, their resolve. Jamal let the moment breathe, allowing their voices to rise and resonate. Then he spoke once more, his voice filled with quiet strength. "We're here, standing together, and we won't stop until justice becomes the norm, not the exception. This isn't just my fight, it's all of ours. And together, we're going to make sure that change isn't just a promise, it's a reality." As the crowd continued to cheer, Jamal felt a deep sense of purpose settle within him. This was only the beginning, but he knew they had the power to see it through. The movement had begun, and together, they would turn this moment into a force for lasting, systemic change. As the crowd outside slowly began to disperse, Lieutenant Kate Thompson stood by her office window, watching the last of the demonstrators lingering near the station. The sounds of chanting had faded, replaced by the distant hum of city traffic. But the impact of the day's events lingered heavily. Jamal West's words still echoed in her mind, his call for justice and accountability stirring something deep within her, a need for change that went beyond mere words. Thompson turned from the window, her gaze sweeping over the quiet, dimly lit office. The files and reports on her desk suddenly felt like relics from a different time, reminders of a system that she'd once believed in but now knew needed transformation. The events of the day had exposed the fragility of that belief, and she could no longer deny the uncomfortable truths that had surfaced. For too long, she'd trusted that the department would uphold fairness and justice. Now, she realized that trust alone wasn't enough. Taking a deep breath, Thompson sat down at her desk, her thoughts swirling with purpose and urgency. She could still see the faces of Riley and Jenkins during her interrogation, their reluctance to accept responsibility, their inability to see the gravity of their actions. She knew that accountability couldn't stop with a single suspension or a public apology. Real change would demand a complete shift in the department's culture, in the way officers saw their role within the community. She pulled out a notebook, her pen poised above the blank page, and began to write. Training reforms, bias recognition programs, clear protocols for community engagement, ideas she had previously considered idealistic, but now recognized as essential. She wrote until the page was filled, each word a step toward a vision she was beginning to understand. She would bring these changes to her superiors, advocate for them, and push until they became standard practice. But it wasn't just about policies. Thompson knew that transformation required more than new rules. It demanded introspection, a willingness to confront biases, and a commitment to transparency that went beyond public statements. She resolved to meet with community leaders like Jamal, to learn from their experiences, to bring their perspectives into the department in a way that would hold her officers accountable. This wasn't just about repairing trust, it was about building it anew from the ground up. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Officer Stevens entered, his expression pensive. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you for handling today the way you did. It couldn't have been easy." Thompson gave a small nod, her gaze steady. "It wasn't easy, Stevens, but it was necessary." She closed her notebook, placing her pen down. "And it's just the beginning. We're going to make some changes around here, real changes." Stevens nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I'm with you, Lieutenant." As he left, Thompson looked down at her notes, a newfound resolve hardening within her. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, that there would be resistance, and that change would come slowly. But she was prepared to push forward, knowing that this was the right course. She would do everything in her power to ensure that her department became the kind of institution that served and respected every citizen equally. Thompson rose, a sense of purpose steadying her as she left her office. This was no longer just her duty, it was her mission. The events of the day had lit a fire within her, and she was ready to make that fire spread, determined to reshape her department into a force for justice and integrity. After the day's events, Jamal knew he couldn't simply return to his regular life. The injustice he'd experienced and the response of the community had awakened something deeper in him, a responsibility to turn this moment into a movement. In the weeks that followed, Jamal channeled his energy into creating the Community Justice Initiative, a group dedicated to pushing for police reform, civil rights education, and community empowerment. The initiative grew rapidly. Jamal held meetings at community centers, churches, and local schools, drawing people of all ages and backgrounds. Some were activists, eager to support change, while others were everyday citizens who had witnessed the inequality firsthand. Their stories poured out, each one a testament to the pervasive injustices they faced, each one strengthening Jamal's resolve to create a space where their voices could be heard. At one of the first gatherings, Jamal stood before a packed room, his presence commanding yet compassionate. "What happened to me isn't unique," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of truth. "But we have the power to make sure it doesn't keep happening to me, to you, to anyone." His words struck a chord, igniting a sense of purpose among those in attendance. He went on to organize workshops on knowing one's rights, equipping people with the legal tools to protect themselves. Attorneys from around the city volunteered their time, helping to explain the often confusing legal system and showing people how to assert their rights with confidence. Jamal understood that true empowerment came from knowledge, and he wanted his community to feel strong, informed, and prepared. The initiative also established a community oversight board, working with city officials to monitor police activity and provide unbiased reviews of incidents involving law enforcement. Jamal met with local leaders, advocating for transparency and accountability, using his legal expertise to bridge the gap between citizens and officials. He pushed for regular, open dialogues between the police and the community, determined to make communication a cornerstone of lasting change. Word of Jamal's work spread quickly. People came from neighboring towns, curious and inspired by the movement he had started. His story was shared widely, becoming a symbol of resilience and justice. Soon, media outlets began covering the initiative's progress, their stories amplifying his mission and bringing even more support. Donations started pouring in from around the country, funding community programs, legal aid, and workshops for young people on leadership and activism. Through it all, Jamal remained humble, driven not by fame but by a deep sense of responsibility. He knew that real change required sustained effort, and he was prepared for the long road ahead. With each step, he built alliances, forged partnerships, and nurtured a sense of solidarity within the community that felt unbreakable. The initiative also began reaching out to local schools, setting up mentorship programs for at-risk youth. Jamal understood the importance of giving young people hope and direction, of showing them that they could be part of a future where justice and respect were not just ideals but realities. His team arranged after-school programs focused on leadership, self-empowerment, and social justice, helping young people find purpose and confidence. One afternoon, as he walked through the crowded office of the initiative, surrounded by volunteers and community members working together, Jamal felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just his mission, it was a shared vision, a collective effort toward a better, fairer world. Jamal knew the work was far from over, but he saw the seeds of change taking root in the hearts of the people around him. With each meeting, each workshop, and each small victory, he felt the power of a community united. They weren't just reacting to injustice, they were building a foundation for lasting transformation, one step at a time. The Training Academy auditorium was filled with rows of fresh, eager faces, all wearing crisp uniforms and wide eyes that betrayed a mix of excitement and nerves. Jamal stood at the podium, his presence calm yet commanding. The Community Justice Initiative had come a long way, and this opportunity to speak to new recruits on their first day felt like a culmination of all he had worked toward. Lieutenant Thompson sat off to the side, her arms crossed, watching with a quiet pride that reflected the transformation in her own journey. The department had implemented many of the reforms Jamal and the community had fought for, and this speech was a testament to their commitment to accountability and respect. Jamal began, his voice measured and thoughtful. "Each of you has chosen a path of service," he said, looking out over the recruits, "a path that demands courage, integrity, and a willingness to protect every member of this community with equal respect and compassion." The room was silent, the recruits listening intently as Jamal's words settled over them. "Your badge is not just a symbol of authority," he continued. "It's a commitment, a promise that you will uphold the dignity of every person you encounter. Remember, this uniform gives you power, yes, but that power comes with a responsibility to use it wisely, justly." He paused, letting the gravity of his words take root. "I stand here before you because not long ago, I was someone who experienced the consequences of a broken system. But I'm also here because of people like you, people who chose to make a difference, who chose to listen and to learn." Jamal turned, glancing at Thompson, who gave him an encouraging nod. Then, he faced the recruits again, his gaze unwavering. "You have the power to make this community better, to build bridges of trust instead of walls of fear. Every interaction, every decision, every small act of kindness or respect can make a difference. Remember, justice isn't just something you find in a courtroom. It's in how you treat people every day." He could see their faces soften, their posture relax as they absorbed his words. Jamal knew they were at the beginning of a long journey, that the lessons they learned today would shape their actions in the years to come. "As you go forward," he continued, "know that people are counting on you, not just to protect them but to see them, to hear them, to understand their struggles. When you put on that uniform, you're becoming a part of something bigger than yourself, and with that comes the duty to serve with humility and fairness." The room was silent, the recruits' expressions filled with reflection and determination. Jamal felt a surge of hope, a sense that the future held the possibility of real change, not just in policies but in the hearts of those who would wear the badge. After he finished, the room erupted into applause. Thompson joined him, shaking his hand with a sense of gratitude and shared purpose. Together, they looked out at the room of recruits, both feeling the strength of a partnership that had transformed from adversaries to allies. As Jamal left the station that day, he felt a profound sense of closure and optimism. The road to justice would always be winding, but he could see the path forward clearly now, lit by the determination of a community that would not be silenced. And with every new recruit who walked through those doors, he knew that together, they were building a foundation for a future where dignity, respect, and justice were not just ideals but realities, one step, one voice, one action at a time.